Hi, everyone. Welcome to Lead. In this series on Litera TV, we'll be exploring leadership from a whole bunch of different angles. And I'll get to have a guest with me on every session to talk about their perspectives on leadership, their experiences leading, and learnings for the rest of us. So can't wait for today's discussion. Quick intro, my name is Will. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer here at Litera. And for today, I'm so fortunate to have as our guest, Dr. Kathy Lofy, who's the Chief Health Officer and Chief Science Officer for the state of Washington. So welcome, Dr. Lofy. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Will. Good morning. Pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So I think to start, maybe it would be helpful to give everyone a brief context on what your role is and what you do in that role. I bet by title, most folks don't know exactly what a Chief Health and Chief Science Officer does. So maybe a little bit on what that role is and your journey to that position.
Sure. Yeah, so my position is I am the State Health Officer and the Chief Science Officer at the Washington State Department of Health. This agency is our state public health agency, and I know that a lot of people are not familiar with public health, what public health does normally. But maybe since the pandemic started, probably people are more aware of what public health does, because one of our roles is to control communicable diseases in populations. So as the state health officer, I lead pretty much the scientific arm of our agency and our data folks. In public health, we collect a lot of data to understand the health of the population. I oversee a lot of the data work and also make sure that all of our programs and policies are based in science. In addition, I sit on our agency executive team. The agency has about 1,700 employees. We sit in the executive branch of government. As a member of the executive team, I help with, strategic planning for the agency and for really the whole public health system in Washington.
Awesome. That's a lot on your plate, I'm sure. Tell us about your path to this role and to this agency. I know you had an interesting path to get there.
Yeah, so I am a trained pediatrician, and back in 2002, I left clinical medicine to do an epidemiology training program with the Centers for Disease Control. And this is a program that trains physicians and nurses to be epidemiologists and public health leaders. After I finished that training program with the Centers for Disease Control, I took a job with the Washington State Department of Health, working as a communicable disease epidemiologist. And that's a long way of saying I was essentially a disease detective for 12 years. Communicable disease epidemiologists investigate outbreaks of of different infectious diseases that happen, that can be foodborne outbreaks, can be outbreaks of tuberculosis, of measles, of whooping cough. And I worked as an epidemiologist in the agency for about 12 years. And then the current health officer in the agency retired. And I was asked to actually step in as the acting health officer. And I thought that would be an interesting way to sort of dip my toe in the water and take on sort of some new responsibilities. So I was the acting health officer for about 3 months. And after being in the role for about 3 months, I was offered the position.
You went from a dipping of the toe to a full dive, right?
Exactly.
So tell us a little bit about it. I'm interested in, everyone's path is so unique to a leadership role, but I think yours is particularly interesting because you went from disease detective, which I might call sort of in more of the business world, like an individual contributor role. From there, a straight jump into a executive leadership role, essentially. So what was going through your mind, first of all? Why did you think you could do that? What gave you the confidence to do that? And yeah, what essentially made you take that leap?
Yeah, no, that's true. I essentially went, I like to think of it as like from the very bottom of the org chart, being sort of the individual kind of worker bee in the agency, to sort of the top of the org chart, which was a really big leap for me at the time. So there are a couple of things that kind of went through my mind. Well, first of all, I was getting, I think, a little bit restless in my current position. I'm the type that, likes to learn. And I think I'd sort of gotten, after doing communicable disease work for 12 years, sort of got to the point where, I didn't feel like I was learning as much every day as I used to. And so was feeling a little bit restless from that perspective. I was 42 at the time. I had young children. My husband was sick. And was not really sure if it was kind of the right timing for me. It was kind of one of those positions that I wanted when I was 50, not when I was 42. But it was my late husband actually who really convinced me that, I really had to take this opportunity, because some leadership positions, such as this position, it was not going to come along. It may not come along again. And he sort of said, this is a great opportunity. It may not be here for you when you are 50 and ready to be in this position. And so, really convinced me that I needed to try it out. I was really scared, not sure that, I really wasn't sure that, I could do it. But things have worked out. And it sort of reminds me of a quote. One of my biggest role models is my current boss, and he once told me he never took a job that he actually thought he could do. And I was like, okay, that's kind of interesting that he sort of lived, that was sort of, how he advanced in his career. So that also motivated me to give it a try.
That's a great quote. Yeah, great kind of guiding principle. And I guess that is how we grow, right? I mean, if we step into things that we don't think we can do in the moment, that's almost the definition of growth. Mm-hmm. Do you recall in those first, days or weeks or months or years, when did you feel like, okay, I've got this? I'm sure it was challenging. We'd love to hear some of those challenges. But when did you feel like, okay, this was, I can be the leader I want to be?
I'm not sure if that moment has come yet.
Still working through it.
No, I would say it was several years into my job. I mean, when I started, I think I was probably a deer in the headlights. There was so much for me to learn. The job was so different from what I had been doing previously. Over time, different projects, different, issues that you work through just give you more confidence, I think, and, and being able to, do the job successfully. But I would definitely say it was several years before I sort of hit that comfort level, in this particular position.
Gotcha. Well, I know that what you've been living for the last many months, so I promised you we wouldn't talk a lot about COVID. But I did want to ask, specific to a public health role, or perhaps just a public leadership role in general. How do you lead effectively, and what have been the challenges for you to lead when, at least my assumptions about that environment is that you have a much broader range of stakeholders potentially than many of us leading in the private sector. So yeah, how do you give us, I guess, a taste of what it looks like, and also how do you lead effectively when you have so many different types of stakeholders?
Yeah, I think one thing that's really different in my position compared to your position, Will, is that I work for essentially 7.5 million people. And those are the residents, of Washington that I, who pay my salary, who I, have been hired to serve. And so, from that particular perspective, I think one thing that's incredibly important in my leadership role is to be a good listener, because there are lots of people who have lots of different ideas about different issues. Lots of people who have different values, than my values. But, I need to listen to everybody's perspective, and really, try to find that path forward. And part of that is about, maybe trying to find common goals. If you have two stakeholder groups who, maybe, look like they're at odds, well, is there something that, both of them can, come together on? I also think it's really important to, be able to compromise, because there's, people have a lot of different views, and I always feel that I'm successful if at the end of the day, I've, done something to make the public a little bit healthier. It may not be exactly the end point that I wanted to get to, but if we've taken a step, towards better health in our population, then, I feel like I have been successful. In addition to listening, I think that, in government in particular, transparency and honesty are incredibly important. Essentially, I feel like everything I do is essentially public. And so I share everything I do. Really, we really do have that value of transparency and of honesty. And sometimes, people may not always agree, but I think to be able to honestly, share why a decision was made, what the thought process is, a group may not have agreed with it, but you're being transparent and honest about, why the decision is made. And I think that goes a really long way and helps to sort of build, relationships, and, into the future.
A lot of stuff in there I'd love to ask you about. I think first one that jumped out to me is around whether if you're leading successfully or not based on metrics. So just for my information, at least, what are the types of metrics and how frequently can you get that feedback to know if you are leading well?
Yeah, so metrics in public health are, I think, can be a little bit more challenging, in, I think, the public sector, because we don't have revenue. I mean, we don't, we provide services. So we obviously have lots of metrics around our services, and are we giving, delivering our services in a timely way? Are we getting customer feedback? And in the end, the metrics I'm most interested in are those metrics that look at the health of our population. And are we really moving that needle? Like, do we have less people, fewer people who are smoking? Are we increasing our life expectancy? Are we making sure that we're not seeing disparities between different types of populations? So those are sort of, some of the metrics that I look at. And then the second half of your question, if you can remind me.
Well, and how frequently do you get those? Do you get, I find that the frequency of reinforcement, of course, lets me know if I'm on or not on the right track. So.
Oh, right. In terms of getting feedback.
Yeah, exactly. Well, whether it's the metrics feedback or even qualitative, but you have to wait 6 months to know if that new smoking cessation campaign had any impact or things like that.
Yeah, so the quantitative metrics we look at do come slowly. It takes a long time to sort of make changes in public health. Qualitative feedback comes back daily. Because people, if they're not happy, with how, their government is serving them, give feedback, which is great. And that's what we want. And that's what will make us better. So I would say the qualitative feedback is quite frequent. The quantitative feedback can be a little bit longer depending on what program, we're implementing.
And on that quantitative side, have you noticed over maybe a decade or so improvement in how we measure, the ways we measure, what we're measuring? Has there been good growth in our ability to both get the right information, get it more quickly and so on? Or have we reached a plateau a little bit in that sense?
Yeah, we've definitely gotten better at public health. Our data systems, while they are still, I think, quite a bit behind the public sector, have gotten better. We are receiving more data in real time that can help us, make real time decisions. and to also measure sort of our progress in real time. We still have a long way to go. I mean, in the public sector, in terms of things we want to do, I mean, we'd love to be able to do, predictive analytics in real time. And a lot of those more complex data analytics that are being done in the private sector. And I have to say, we're not quite there yet.
Gotcha.
But coming along.
Yeah, and it's such an interesting dynamic where it feels to me at least, it's almost like your customers are also your funders, that those that have hired you and are paying for you and your agency are also those you're serving or selling to in our world. It's a very interesting dynamic. You mentioned when talking about the sort of how you lead, this concept of getting everyone on the same page with a single goal, even if it's hard to find. Is it hard to find? I guess how often are you, and I'm thinking of maybe some extreme cases of just almost polar opposite stakeholders in terms of what they'd be looking for. You share a story or two or talk about how you've navigated a challenge where that common goal just can't be found. And what do you do in those cases?
Well, I'll give you one example that public health officials often talk about, where I think we have found some common ground, and that's when it comes to gun owner rights. Obviously, very, very polarized in our country around, people who support firearms and want to have firearms, and then others who don't. And one area that we've been able, where we found some success in public health is having these, two very, opposite groups come together and focus on safety, like, safety of guns in the home. Because, however you feel, about the gun control issue, everybody agrees that they want, the people living in their home to be safe. And so, we have been able, in public health to take these two groups with very, very opposite views and focus on that common goal. And we have found some success, and we now, have some programs where, people who sell guns, now, distribute information about safety, even can support policies, around, safety of storing guns in the home. So I think that's one, it's really a great example where, you can, even groups that seem like they're miles apart, you sometimes can find, that one item that people can really agree to and get behind. And in the end, we make the public health a little better.
Safer. And yeah, that's a good point. And maybe with that example, perhaps we should all be challenged to say, all right, maybe there are no two groups that don't have some common ground that if we're needing to facilitate or lead that we can seek to find. Like that example, Alex, I would have gone in assuming too that there's no common ground there because it is so polarizing. One other question that I was thinking about was, how often do you go into these conversations, as you said, kind of listening sessions, since that was your number one attribute I think you focused on, with a good idea from the beginning, what that person's priorities are, or the angle they're bringing to this versus not, and how do you approach that, sort of allowing yourself to be full learning mode, go in kind of blank slate in your mind, or do you, leaning in a little bit of a maybe preconceived notion about, okay, you're from this group or you're from this entity, so I kind of know why you're here, and how do you navigate that?
Well, I think it's natural for everybody when they're going into a meeting to talk about an issue to have some idea in like my mind as to like what I think should happen. I think I've learned, and I think it's natural. I think I'm always going to do that. But I think I have gotten really good at listening and not being stubborn about like doing it my way. And I think one thing that's really important in leadership is really to pick and choose your battles. I mean, if it's something, from leadership, in leadership positions, you often have sort of the bird's eye view. There's certain things that are really important that would certainly change the direction of, how a project's going. Other things that just don't matter as much. And, really, I think you really have to pick and choose which ones you really want to put your foot down on. And listen to others in the group, and make sure that you're not always going into meetings advocating for your position. In fact, I just had a meeting Sunday about how we wanted to distribute a scarce resource, and I actually had in my mind an idea that I thought was going to be best, and the group had a different idea and thought that it should be done differently, and that's sort of how it ended up. That's the direction that we're going in. And so it's important to listen, and also to take feedback as well, and to find that the solution that everybody is most comfortable with. But being able to know when something kind of crosses the line and is maybe going in a direction that it shouldn't.
Too far. How do you go in with a let's call it a well thought out strong opinion that you go into a conversation with, but not feel almost pride in that opinion, which might keep you from? I mean, this great example on the weekend meeting and decision you had to make was that something that you felt strongly about but didn't feel prideful in, perhaps, so that enabled you to flex on it more quickly? I don't know.
Well, I think another important quality for leaders is to be humble, and to not feel like your ideas are always the best. I think as a leader, it's particularly important to get feedback from people around you, and to set up a team culture and environment where people feel comfortable challenging you, because I think you get to a better answer if people challenge each other's ideas. The ultimate decision is usually a better decision if you can create that environment as a leader, as opposed to having an environment where you state your opinion, everybody's afraid to say something different, and then that's the decision that gets made. So really important, I think, to stay humble and to listen and to create those environments where people can freely share their opinions.
Oh, yeah, thank you. I'm gonna shift gears a little bit. Like I said, I don't want to get into COVID details since that's been your world, but I am curious what sort of how your learnings about either yourself or how to lead have changed over these last 4 or 5 months. Maybe just share with us a couple of things that the new ahas for you, given what you've had to navigate most recently.
Yeah, I think one of the one of the biggest learnings for me during the past few months has been the need to kind of pace myself and pace my team, and to actually take a break when I need it. And I remember, about maybe 6 or 8 weeks, maybe about 6 weeks ago, I sort of hit a wall, and I was exhausted and I was cranky and I started kind of snapping at people around me, and, was sort of able to recognize that, this is not healthy for me. It's not healthy for my team. I'm going to be, damaging relationships that need to be good relationships for the next several months. And, essentially just called my boss and said, I need a break. I need to just take a day or two off, and I just need to sort of recharge. And so I think that was one of my, that's been one of my biggest learnings as a leader, and also sort of being able to recognize when folks on your team, are at that point as well, because it's an it's incredibly stressful situation. It's incredibly demanding, mentally and physically, and long hours of work. And, we do just need to make sure that we're all like kind of taking care of ourselves, so that we can, take care of others.
Yeah, just a few weeks into this, I think we had a similar realization at Litera, and we said, essentially, we started talking about mental health quite a bit, and we said, if any day you need a mental health break, take it, more or less, and we're all challenging ourselves to do that as well. So I'm glad you shared that, and I guess I will be a megaphone and echo it a little bit too. I think that's so critical right now, that both for ourselves as leaders, we're taking those breaks so that we can then lead more effectively, but encouraging it in our teams as well. So for everyone listening, I hope your organizations will allow you to do the same, because that is perhaps the most critical public health issue right now, in my opinion. I'll insert that. Thank you for sharing that. You mentioned your current boss is one of your top, kind of leadership role models. Any others, or any other learnings from him or her in particular that you'd like to share? I really like that quote that you shared earlier.
Um, I think I touched on this briefly, but one thing he's really taught me is the importance of, creating a team culture where there's a lot of trust and openness. The last thing you want as a leader on your team is for people on your team to be like sweeping problems under the rug, because they're afraid to, approach you, with problems that they may be having on their team. And it's just critically important that people, you have that culture where people can bring problems forth, and then you can therefore support them in solving those problems. And they know if they bring the problem forth, they will get support and help, as opposed to, somehow being punished, for the problems that we're having. I mean, that's the one thing I've learned that is just absolutely critical. And then again, just to set up that culture on your team so that people feel comfortable disagreeing with you. Once you get into that group think mentality and nobody challenges each other, then you don't come to, you don't, analyze problems as deeply as you should. And, in the end are probably not coming to the best decision. So it's just, that's the one thing he's really taught me, is to, make sure that you have that culture on your team where people feel included, people feel like they can express their opinions. And it does, you have to actually take time to create that culture. We do, as an executive team, do an offsite a couple times a year where, we do just check in. How are people doing personally? How are people doing professionally? How do you think our team is functioning? And so you really need to invest the time to get to that type of team culture.
You've shared a lot around what we need to do as leaders, whether it's listening or focusing on culture, creating the team culture. I'm curious if you think about, as an individual specifically, if you had to pick the top 3 qualities that you find in yourself, or just studying other leaders around you, the top 3 qualities of a leader, what would they be?
Well, I have an interesting story to tell, because I was in a room with a number of leaders several months ago, and there was an icebreaker exercise that was done at the start of the meeting.
We love those, right? Yes.
And we were all asked to write down on a piece of paper the one word that describes the core value by which you lead your life. It was by far like the most interesting icebreaker that I think I've ever done. And I have to say, of all the leaders in the room, I think over half of them wrote down either honesty or integrity or transparency, something sort of along those lines. And so I think that would probably have to be sort of up there, and in my book, for one of kind of the most important qualities of a leader. And it kind of played out in that exercise because there are a number of different leaders who, I mean, that was their just core value in life as well. And you can tell that carried over into their leadership roles. So that's one. I already talked a little bit about humility. I think humility is really important in a leader. And then I also just touched on briefly, I think it's really important for leaders to empower their staff and then support their staff and help them be successful. And I think that is, one of the, those are probably my top 3 qualities for a leader that I would choose.
Well, that is a wonderful way to close. I think if we all could live with, honesty and integrity and humility, and then also empowering our teams, or frankly, probably whatever roles we're in, family roles as well. I think those would carry very well. So thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a wonderful chat, and really appreciate your time. I know you're super busy, so thanks for taking out half an hour to talk with me.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye-bye.